92b, and the Gemara is talking about the people that the Torah mentions that are exempt, or rather than exempt, that couldn't do the first Pesach, and that they have a makeup date, the Pesach Sheni, they can redo it. And our Mishnah mentions the two, Misha Yatame, somebody who had a Tuma, as well as Misha Yabedar Chachoka, somebody who was at too far of a distance from the Beis Hamikdash or Yerushalayim and couldn't make it in time to make to bring the Korban Pesach, so that they would have a makeup date. Actually, as our Mishnah said, not only somebody who had one of these two hindrances, but any anything that was forcibly blocking them from being able to bring the Korban Pesach, or shagag, or any mistake they made, or actually we saw even if they did so intentionally, they could still have a makeup date, only that they would have kares. There is a transgression punishment of their soul being cut off of its source. So the Gemara told us that there was a machlokes between Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes. According to Rav Nachman, if somebody had, even though that they were too far of a distance, but somebody brought the Korban Pesach for them, then it would count. That means, let's say the sun sets at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. They realize they're not going to make it into Yerushalayim to be able to bring the Korban Pesach until 6 o'clock, so they won't have time to actually bring the Korban Pesach. However, they will get there in time to eat and participate for that night, and they will be a part of the group. Does that count? Can somebody bring the Korban Pesach on their behalf if they're really too far away, as it is? So the Rav Nachman says that would count, and Rav Shesha says it doesn't count. And the Rav Nachman is going to try and prove it from our Mishnah itself, from the fact that it says in our Mishnah that if somebody was tamei or he was at a distance and didn't bring the Korban Pesach, the inference is, had he brought the Korban Pesach, that it would count. It's only if he was at a distance and he didn't bring the Korban Pesach. To which the Gemara said, no, that can't be the inference. You can't infer that from the Mishnah, because what about the next part where it says if he had forgotten or he was forcibly blocked from bringing the Korban Pesach, and he didn't bring the Korban Pesach? There, obviously, it doesn't mean, and if he had brought it, it would be okay, because he was forcibly blocked or had forgotten about it. So clearly, that's not what it means. Rather, over there, it's talking about in a third scenario, which is hinted to, alluded to, but not actually in the text, and it's referring to somebody who was intentionally negligent and didn't bring the Korban Pesach. So it's three things: somebody who forgot, somebody who was forcibly blocked, or somebody who just didn't bring the Korban Pesach. And in each one of those, he couldn't have a makeup date. However, in the last one, there was also the punishment of kares. So too in the first case, where it mentioned somebody was at a distance or somebody who was tamei, and he didn't make the Korban Pesach, and he didn't, is referring to an unnamed, somebody who had lost an immediate relative that day and couldn't bring the Korban Pesach, where he's going to have a makeup date of Pesach Sheni. So Gemara says that actually the Mishnah, the text of the Mishnah infers this as well. It seems accurate this way. Amar Rav Ashi, and this is about 8-10 lines from the bottom of 92b. Amar Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi says, Masnitin Amideke. The exact words of the Mishnah also seem to indicate this. Tani elu petura mihikaris. It says these are exempt from kares, ve'elu chayav mikares, and these are punishable by kares. Now, which ones are they referring to? Because the Mishnah, in the simple reading of the text, only mentions 4 people that didn't do the Korban Pesach: somebody who was himself tamei, somebody who was at a distance, somebody who was who had forgotten, inadvertently didn't bring the Korban Pesach, or somebody who forcibly was held back from bringing the Korban Pesach. Now, it says these are exempt and these are held liable with kares. Kares being the soul cut off from its source. Who is it talking about that they do get the punishment of kares? Ile mashagig bananas is a talk about somebody who inadvertently didn't bring it, or somebody who was forcibly stopped. Shagig bananas make kares. Can they be punishable? We know that kares is only for an intentional act, and these are not intentional transgressions. Elalav amazit must be talking about that it was an intentional act, and even though that the text doesn't clearly state it when it said and someone who and he didn't do the Karban Pesach, it means or someone who hadn't done the Karban Pesach intentionally, or somebody who couldn't do it because of their sadness, because of their exemption of having lost an immediate relative. Rav Nachman says no. It's only talking about somebody who intentionally and it wasn't neglected to bring the Karban Pesach. And it should have said that he transgresses and he's chayiv. So why does it say it in the plural that they are punishable by kares? I did because it said first these are exempt, plural, so it said these are obligated, but it's really in the singular only someone who's intentional. But in the first part of the Mishnah, we're going to have to say that it's talking about that one who traveled at a distance, or was at a distance, and somebody brought the Karban Pesach for him, it would work. Amar Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi says, well, let me try and prove my point that if somebody was at a distance and the Karban Pesach was brought, that it would not count. It was brought on his behalf. It would not count because the Torah it clearly exempted somebody who was outside of the confines, whatever distance derech harchaka is. We'll see later. So Rav Shesha says, how do I know this? The Tani we learned, Rabbi Kiva Eimer. Rabbi Kiva says, Ne'emar tamei v'ne'emar b'derech harchaka. The Torah says, if somebody was tamei, or he was in a path, a way that was far away. So the Torah juxtaposes these. So Kiva says, now we're on Tzaddik Gimel Amud Aleph, 93a. Ma tamei shesipik biyadei lases ve'ein ha'iseh. Rabbi Kiva expresses, it says, when somebody's tamei, what does it mean that they're tamei? They're able to bring the Karban Pesach, but they may not bring the Karban Pesach. So he has the ability, and yet he doesn't do it. And then he may not, that the first Pesach doesn't count, and he brings the second one. So too, in somebody who's at a distance, it means that he has a way that he could potentially do it, meaning he has family waiting for him in Yerushalayim, they're bringing the Karban Pesach on his behalf, but he's too far away, so he can't be a part of the Karban Pesach. So we see that even if it's brought on his behalf, it's not going to count. Rav Nachman says, of course, that is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. But Rabbi Akiva tamei the kasavei shechta v'zerkan al tamei sheretz. That's, as we saw a few days ago, somebody who's tamei sheretz, that means that he didn't go to the mikveh yet for having come into contact with the rodent. But that day he'll be able to go to the mikveh, and that evening he'll be able to eat the Karban Pesach. And yet, there is an opinion, and Rav Nachman says that is Rabbi Akiva's opinion, that you cannot bring the Karban Pesach in shecht and v'zark, and you cannot shecht the Karban Pesach and spritz it for someone who is a tamei sheretz, even though by the evening he'll be able to eat it. But right now he hadn't gone to the mikveh yet, so right now he's tamei. So you can't bring the Karban Pesach for him, even though that by the time it's necessary to eat it, and as we've seen many times now, the shechting of the Karban Pesach is for the people that are going to eat it, and he's going to be able to eat it at that point. But since now he's not valid to bring the Karban Pesach, he hadn't gone to the mikveh, you can't bring the Karban Pesach for him. And so too over here. This person's at a distance. He's too far. He's stuck in traffic outside of the city. He's going to be able to make it by the evening, but not in time to shech the Karban Pesach. So we're going to exclude him, even though that in theory, he's able to make it for tonight. But Rabbi Akiva, we already saw by Tumah. The fact that he's going to be able to eat it tonight is not enough to say that we can bring the Karban Pesach for him. So too, the fact that he'll be in town by tonight doesn't mean that we can bring the Karban Pesach for him. Vana, Rav Nachman says, and I follow the opinion that says that you can bring the Karban Pesach for someone who's going to be valid and available tonight, even though right now he's still tummy. Tana Rabbana. So the Brisa taught, here are a list of people that do not bring the Korban Pesach first time round, and bring the Korban Pesach the second time in ER. What is this? Hazavim v'hazavas. People who had abnormal emissions, whether it's abnormal semen emission or abnormal menstrual flow, ametzorais, male and female people that had tsaras, let's call it leprosy, venidas, and a woman had a menstrual flow, a boil nidas, and a man who is tamei nida because he had relations with someone who had not gone to the mikveh after her last menstrual flow. Vayoldas, somebody gave birth. Hashegim anusin, somebody who just forgot about Korban Pesach, or somebody was forcibly or by situation held back from bringing Korban Pesach. Vamizidin, and even someone who intentionally didn't bring the Korban Pesach. V'tamei, somebody, and the ones mentioned in the Torah, somebody who himself was tamei, or somebody who was at a distance and couldn't come in. So all these would be exempt of the Korban, would be obligated in bringing the second Pesach, a makeup day. So Gemara says, well, you essentially said anybody that didn't bring the first Pesach is going to be obligated in making a second Pesach, the makeup date. Well, if this is true for everyone, so why did the Torah give us specific two cases? Someone was tamei or was at a distance. Imkein lama nema tamei, and lama nema the iboyla me'avid b'rishon leishav kinele. Why did it say tamei? To tell you, obviously, so that he's not allowed to do it the first time. Some of these are allowed to. Somebody obviously who was negligent, right, or forgot, they would be allowed to bring it the first time around. They simply didn't. But the reason the Torah mentioned tamei to tell you that he's not allowed to bring the Korban Pesach. So why did it mention somebody who was at a distance? To exempt him from the kares, but actually he should have brought it, and if somebody had brought it for him, it would count. And this is proof to Rav Nachman that if he had brought it or had somebody bring it on his behalf, it would work. So this is the text that this Bryce's text seems to indicate, like Rav Nachman, that had somebody brought it for him, it would be valid. Isha b'sheni mi mechayva. So now the Gemara just challenges. We listed a whole bunch of cases where a woman would bring the second Pesach in the makeup date. Is that really true that she's obligated? Vatani, we learned when we have a brisa that says, perhaps you'd think only the two mentioned in the Torah, somebody was tamei or at a distance, they would make the second Korban Pesach. But somebody who didn't, anybody else that didn't bring the first Pesach cannot make it, cannot have a makeup date. Therefore, how do we know a man who had an abnormal semen emission, a zav, a man who was a mitzora, a man who had relations with someone who was a nida minayin, tamalem ish ish. So it says any man that was tamei to tell you any type of tumah. Now, that brisa clearly indicates that it's males that are obligated in the makeup date. Well, that's already machlekes. We saw the other day that according to Rabbi Yossi, women are obligated in Korban Pesach first time round as well as in the makeup date, and that in Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, they are not obligated. According to Rabbi Yehuda, they may join a group that has men in it, and according to Rabbi Shimon, they don't even join a group. But the distinction we saw was that Rabbi Yossi says that women are obligated in Korban Pesach first time around and second time, and the makeup date as well. Tana Rabbanan. Chayav korelis al arishan v'chayav korelis al hasheni. Divrei Rebbe. So here the next machlokes is really going to get into how to view the makeup date, the Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. The Torah says if somebody did not bring the Korban Pesach when they were supposed to, they get their punishment is kares, their soul is cut off from its source. Now, the Torah also says if somebody didn't bring a Korban Pesach the first time round, he brings it the second time. How do we view this? Do we say if somebody inadvertently didn't bring it the first time around, but intentionally didn't bring it the second time around? So is the kares punishment for the first Pesach? And therefore, if they didn't bring it the first time around unintentionally, so there's no kares, because kares is a punishment for an intentional, a wanton disregard for the mitzvah. Even though that the second time round they could have brought it and they knew about it and they did not forget and they should have done it and they didn't, there's no kares, because after all, the makeup date is simply a makeup date for the first Pesach, and the first Pesach was inadvertent. Or do we say, no, there is a punishment of kares for the first, as well as a punishment of kares for the second. And if somebody intentionally misses the second Pesach, even if the first time they missed it was because they were tamei or they mistakenly forgot, they forgot it, they would be obligated. They would have kares simply for missing the second one intentionally, and so that we see that it's a separate kares for each one. So that's the opinion of Rebbe. Rebbe says there is a punishment of kares for somebody intentionally missing the first Pesach, as well as a separate kares for somebody intentionally missing the second Pesach. Rabbi Nassan mechayev kares al harishon and patar al sheni. Now Rabbi Nassan says no, that there's only a kares for the first one, for intentionally missing the first Pesach. Intentionally missing the second Pesach does not get the punishment of kares. And Reb Chananya ben Akabi Omer, he says, Afal harishon and mechayev kares elim kei lo yasa sasheni. He says actually the makeup date is in place of kares, and he views it like this: the first Pesach, if somebody intentionally misses it, they have a opportunity to save themselves from kares by bringing the second Pesach. If they intentionally don't bring the second Pesach, so now they had an opportunity to fix their mistake and they didn't. That's where the kares kicks in. And this is based on a perspective that each one of them has on how to view the second Pesach as a makeup date for the first, as a separate mitzvah, or somewhere in between. The Tani we learned, Gershon is gar ben shnei pesachim, and this would be very relevant if it's a separate mitzvah for someone who converted after Pesach. So if it's a makeup for the first date, so they're not obligated. They were not Jewish at the time that the first mitzvah was there. They're not obligated in a makeup date. But if you learn that the second Pesach is simply another opportunity for the same mitzvah, but not a makeup date, it's its own mitzvah, and it's just another opportunity for that mitzvah. So somebody converted in between will be obligated in the second Pesach. So Gershon is gar ben shnei pesachim, v'chein katan sheigdal ben shnei pesachim, or a child that turned adult between the two Pesachs. Chayav lasses Pesach sheni. Divrei Rebbe. Rebbe says, this is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He says that this convert or this child who became an adult between first and second Pesach, they would be obligated in the second Pesach, even though they weren't obligated in the first. So they don't have to have a makeup date for something that they were never obligated in. Nevertheless, it's an independent mitzvah, so they're obligated. However, Rabbi Nassan Eimer, kosher zakik l'rishon, zakik l'sheni, kosher ain't zakik l'rishon, ain't zakik l'sheni. He says, no. The second one is a makeup date for the first. And if you weren't obligated in the first one, you're not obligated in the second. And therefore, also, he says that there is no kares for the second. The kares is only for the first because the second is simply a makeup date. Whereas Rebbe says there's a separate kares for the second one because it's a separate mitzvah. But Maikami Palgi, what's the basis in the verses for this? Rebbe Savar Sheni Regal B'fnei Atzmayu, and Rabbi Nosson Savar Sheni Tashlumi the Rishenu. Rebbe says that the second Pesach is an independent mitzvah, independent yontif like the first, and and Rabbi Nosson says no, the second is a makeup date. It's a tashlumin for the first if you miss the first. Tekuni l'rishon le'misakele, and therefore the second Pesach cannot undo the kares of the first, but it will simply give you the opportunity to do the mitzvah again. But if you missed it, you missed it. Rabbi Chananya ben Akavi, however, Chananya ben Akavi, he says, "Sovar sheni takanta the rishonu," that the second is a makeup date, and it can exempt you of the kares. It can actually fix the first one as well. And they all look at the same pasuk and have a different drash for it. And this is based on the word ki in the pasuk. The word ki is in the Torah can have multiple meanings. It can mean because. It can mean however. It can mean though. So the word ki can have multiple meanings. And over here, this transitional word of ki is going to be the basis for the machlokas. The Torah says if someone were tahor and wasn't at a distance, so it was available to bring the Korban Pesach. He was in Yerushalayim, not at a distance. He was tahor. He was not tummy, and he chadal la'asas pasach, and he was negligent or held back from doing the Korban Pesach. So that soul will be cut off from its nation, from its source. Ki Korban Hashem lo yihikriv. Ki, the Korban of Hashem he didn't bring. It could be because he didn't bring the Korban Pesach, or even though he didn't bring the Korban Pesach, or however the Korban Pesach he didn't bring. How do we read this? So, so they say V'ish asher hu b'torah b'derech lo yhaya. If he was tahor and not on a path at a distance. So Rebbe Sava v'chad lasa Pesach, he held back from doing the Pesach v'nichrasa delay avad barisha. He gets kares for not doing it the first time round. Inami, or Korban Hashem lehikriv, or he didn't bring it in the second Pesach. So that or that key he learns as well as he didn't bring the Korban Pesach in its time, and that too would be a kares. So there's a kares for each one. And so now Gemara says, and how do we know that what it says afterwards? Ki Korban Hashem lehikriv he carries his sin. So how do you know that that's kares for the second part as well, for not bringing the Korban Pesach in the second time, in its time? So now we turn to 93b, Tzadik Gimel Amud Beis, Kasavar Megadev Hanim Avarach Hashem. The Torah says, Sashemu Megadev Menichasa Nefesh Shehi Avon Yisa. Somebody who curses or speaks about negatively about Hashem is Megadev. So the Torah says the term Megadev gets kares and he carries his sin. So that's the same term over here of carrying the sin. And over there, carrying the sin means Megadev carries a sin. And Megadev, he says, is cursing Hashem. And as Hashem Kollel v'nichrasa, and it says in the Torah that somebody who curses Hashem carries his sin. So now we know a Megadev is gets kares, and we know, and if you say Megadev means somebody who curses Hashem, and we know someone who curses Hashem carries a sin. It says by cursing Hashem, it says one who blesses Hashem. It's a euphemism because the text doesn't want to say someone who curses Hashem. So if Hashem, which is the interpretation of Megadev according to this opinion, that he carries his sin. And over there by Megadev it says kares. So now we know that the term Manasa Cheta, carrying his sin, is the meaning of kares, of the soul being cut off of its source. And so over here also by not bringing the Korban Pesach, where it says he carries his sin, it means kares. Ma'alahalan, kares afkan kares, just as over there it means kares, so too here. That's the way Rebbe learns. So he learns the meaning ki, that as well as he didn't bring the Korban Pesach. Rabbi Nassan Sava v'chad lasa Pesach v'nichrusa dahai ki loshen daha. And he says that the meaning of the word ki is since. He didn't bring the Korban Pesach, and his soul will be cut off since he didn't bring the Pesach in its time, in the second makeup date. V'achikam rachmana Korban Hashem lehikriv b'mayadei barisha, in the first one. Since he didn't bring it in the first one, he is b'mayadei barisha. Since he didn't bring it in its time at the first date, sorry, I said the second. According to Rabbi Nassan, he reads the verse like this: he didn't bring the Korban Pesach in its time. He held back of bringing it, so he gets kares since he didn't bring the Korban Pesach in its time and the first time around. And then it says Cheta Yisa. Again, it repeats the term after it says kares, and it's only talking about the first Pesach. It says Cheta Yisa. He's going to carry his sin. So what does it mean he will carry his sin at the end of the verse? According to Rebbe, it meant to tell you that if you miss the second Pesach, there's kares as well. But according to Rabbi Nassan, that's not true. That the verses only talk about the first Pesach. So what is it? Why is it mentioned he will carry his sin? He says that the term Megadev, where it says that somebody's Megadev gets kares, that's somebody who beautifies idolatry and praises idolatry or idols. So therefore, we don't know what punishment for somebody who blesses Hashem or curses Hashem. We don't know what punishment there is for someone like that, because the Torah only says that someone as Hashem he curses Hashem, he carries his sin. We don't know what that means. Therefore, the Torah wrote over here the term by Korban Pesach, he carries his sin. And in the text, it says that he gets kares, to tell us that somebody who curses Hashem also gets kares. So from there, they use that term, and they can learn what the term means from over here. Ma'acha, kares, just as over here, the text clearly says it means kares, af hasam kares, so too over there. Reb Chananya, however, he says that, Reb Chananya ben Akavi, he says, v'chada lasas ha-pesach v'nichrasa. The term, the Torah says that he didn't do the Korban Pesach, he will get kares. Now, Korban Hashem lehikriv, the key, Korban Hashem lehikriv, the key over there, it says if he also was negligent to bring the second Pesach, b'sheni, then it's the first one. And also the end of the verse, Cheta Yisa, my avid leika de amran. And like Rabbi Nassan explained, Cheta Yisa is to tell us that the term carrying the sin means kares for elsewhere in the Torah. Hilkach. So now the Gemara says, okay, so what's the conclusion? Hilkach. Hezid b'zeh b'zeh. If somebody was intentionally ignored the Korban Pesach, the first Pesach, as well as the second Pesach, so he didn't use the opportunity to do a mitzvah and didn't use the make-up date opportunity. Divrei hakol chayiv. Everybody will agree that person transgressed kares and is punishable by kares. Shogag bazeh bazeh. If somebody was inadvertent, each one simply didn't remember that there was an obligation, didn't remember that it was Pesach, they were just out of it. So divrei hakol pata, everybody agrees that they are exempt to kares because it was never an intentional act. However, Hazid Barisha Bashagi Basheni, somebody was intentionally missed the first Pesach. And then they said, that was terrible. I'm going to do the make-up date, the second Pesach. And then they forgot because no one else was doing the Korban Pesach, so they forgot. So the make-up date was unintentional. So according to Rabbi Nassan, look, you missed the first Pesach, and that's where it's punishable by kares. The fact that you have a make-up date that you could have done would have maybe saved you from it, maybe not, but it's not going to. But that's not going to change the fact that you intentionally missed the date for Korban Pesach. So there's kares. However, Mechayvi, Rabbi Chanani ben Akavia, but Chanani ben Akavi, he says, no, since you have to miss both intentionally. So if you missed the first one intentionally, but then intended to bring the second Pesach, and you forgot about it, you mistakenly missed it, you're going to be exempt. Shagag Barishim Heza B'Sheni. What about the other way around? The first Pesach, the person was simply forgetful and didn't bring the Korban Pesach. And then, by the time I got to the second Pesach, I said, I'm not going to make a fool of myself. Everybody else already did a Pesach. I'm not going to bring my own Pesach on the second. It looks silly. And he decided intentionally not to do it. So the Rebbe, according to Rebbe, chayev, because it's an independent mitzvah. So there's a kares independently for that. However, Rabbi Nassan Chanani ben Akavia Pata is going to be exempt because the kares is for missing the first one, and the first Pesach he did unintentionally, so there's going to be no kares for it. And the basis again of the pasuk is the Torah says he gets kares because he didn't bring the Korban of Hashem in its time, or ki. So if you say because, so that's the way Rabbi Nassan reads it. So because he didn't bring the Korban Pesach in its time at the first Pesach. However, both Rebbe and Rabbi Hanania ben Akavia, they learn because he didn't bring the Korban Pesach in its time is the makeup date. Rebbe says, and as well as, the key means over there, the word key in Hebrew means as well. And he didn't bring the Korban Pesach, so this kares, as well as he didn't bring the Korban Pesach in its time, the second Pesach, and therefore this kares separately for that. Whereas Hanania, he learns that it's the key over here is if he didn't bring it, and the word key means he didn't bring the Korban Pesach. He was neglectful and didn't bring the Korban Pesach the first time around. So there he gets kares. If he didn't bring the Korban Pesach in its time, the second one, and that's going to be the caveat. The person would have to have missed the first Pesach and intentionally missed the second Pesach as well. The next Mishnah deals with the definition of what would be considered somebody who is b'derech rechoka. How far is somebody who's too far to bring the Korban Pesach? Ezu hi derech rechoka mina modi'in v'lachutz, from Modi'in, which is an area in Eretz Yisrael, and outward. So this was a region, Modi'in, and if from there and onward would count as being outside of the Korban Pesach, outside of the distance of Yerushalayim. That's too far. And that same measure as you have from Yerushalayim to Modi'in, all around Yerushalayim, that same measure, or every direction. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. That's Rabbi Akiva's opinion. However, Rabbi Eliezer says that no, it's not outside of Yerushalayim at a distance from Yerushalayim, but he says you're not in the Beis Hamikdash, you're not in the courtyard. That's too far. Even if you're just a step outside of the threshold of the entryway to the courtyard, that means you're too far. You have to be in the Beis Hamikdash in order to bring the Korban Pesach. Amalei Rabbi Yossi. That's what so Rabbi Yossi said. That now I understand the reason why in the Sefer Torah there's a dot on the hay of the word rechoka. If you're in a path that's at a distance or a distant path. Lefikach nakad al hay loymar lemipnei sharachik vaday. It's not because he's really at a distance, but because he's outside of the Azara and can't bring the Korban Pesach. He's in a space that he can't bring the Korban Pesach. That's an exemption. This idea of being outside of the Beis Hamikdash as an exemption would really only work according to Rav Nachman earlier said. However, if you want to, you can bring the Korban Pesach, because in truth, not everybody in the group was in the courtyard. Only the one who was bringing it on behalf of the group. According to Rav Sheshes, he could not be talking about this. We'll see. Amar Ula. So Ula said, Min Modi'in Yerushalayim 15 milin hava. So he says that from Modi'in to Yerushalayim is a 15 mil, which is about 7 mile distance. A mil is 1,000. 2,000 amas, about 3,500 feet. So, sorry, John, is it an exemption? John is asking, is it an exemption or is it he's not in the place where he's allowed to do it? What do you mean by that?
So I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around the question of he's not in the place, right? He's too far. So I can understand both perspectives, and maybe that's what we're trying to figure out is what's the right answer. But one option seems to be Okay, so if you're not in the Beis Hamikdash, you're not in a place where it can be done. But that's a very different story from I'm too far and I can't even get there in time.
Right, and I think what you're connecting to is the connection I was making about Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes. Earlier we started today with Rav Nachman saying that if you're exempt, but if somebody brings it on your behalf and you make it there at night, it's good, right? You just you get a pass for being at a distance and not being able to bring it. But if somebody brings it for you, that's fine, and that would be even if you're just outside, and that would make sense if you're, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you're just outside in the space. So that's an exemption because look, I wasn't inside, so I didn't bring the Korban Pesach because I was outside. But of course, if somebody brings it for me, it'll be valid. Whereas the other way to see it is, no, you are not eligible.
Right, I don't meet the criteria.
Right, you're not eligible if you're too far. And then even if somebody brings it for you, it's too bad. That was what Rav Sheshes was saying earlier when we started today, and that would only make sense according to Rabbi Akiva that you're way outside of Yerushalayim, 15 milin, which is about 7 miles. And the idea is that if you began walking at the time of the mitzvah began, which is at noon on Erev Pesach, you would make it to Yerushalayim just as the sun was setting, which means you wouldn't have the opportunity of bringing the Korban Pesach. That's where this 15 mil idea is. And the Gemara now explains. He follows the opinion of Rabbi Bar Bachana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, named Rabbi Yochanan, who says, Kama mahalich adam b'yad. What is the distance that a person can walk in a day? Asara parsos. At 10 parsa. 10 parsa is 40 mil. And now 40 mil would be, let's say, about 20 miles. That's what a person can walk in a day. However, in that 40 mil measurement, 5 mil would be from dawn until sunrise. And you can't, so that doesn't count as your day. As well as and another 5 mil would be the amount a person can walk from when the sun sets until when the stars come out, meaning that so meaning what's left of the 40 mil that a person can walk in a day, 10 are lost in from dawn to sunrise, and in dusk from sunset to stars out, to the nightfall. Pashalahu talton. So that means that from sunrise to sunset, you have 30 mil that a person can walk, meaning midday is going to be from midday to the end of the day, 15 in the morning until noon, and from noon till evening, another 15. And so therefore, he says that in the time of noon, from noon, when you can bring the Korban Pesach, until when the sun comes out, the amount of distance that a person can walk is going to be the 15 mil. And that's why he says that from Yerushalayim to Modi'in is 15 mil. And that's why Modi'in is the border of where if somebody's beyond that, it will not be a part of the Korban Pesach, because he couldn't make it in the time of the mitzvah itself. He couldn't make it into Yerushalayim. And now obviously the time of year is going to be different, is going to be a distinction as well, because there are times that in midsummer that you have more than that many hours in the afternoon. But it's talking about a day that is equal from, let's say, from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And this is typically about Pesach time, when the night and day are essentially equal, and that's the calculation in our Mishnah for the distance of Modi'in, 15 mil, and the concept that a person can walk for 40 mil, which is 10 parsos, in a day. Exclude the dawn and dusk parts, and so then you have 30 mil during from sunrise to sunset. Split that in half, 15 mil in the afternoon, which is the time that the Korban Pesach is a mitzvah. So from when the mitzvah began, if he set out from where he is at the time that the mitzvah began, would he be able to make it in time to actually fulfill the mitzvah? And if the answer is no, because a typical person can only walk that distance and make it at sunset, at which point he can no longer do the mitzvah, so that person is exempt. That's the distance. That's the measure for somebody's distance. Say, okay, you're too far. Ula l'taimei, the Amar Ula, according to his explanation, said, as long as he could not make it, if he set out from where he is at the time the mitzvah began, which is noon, all the way, and he couldn't make it in time to actually shecht it in time, that's where the exemption of being too far is. Now, Rashi points out that even though we learned at the beginning of the conversation about the Korban Pesach at Tamid Nishchat, we said that you can only bring the Korban Pesach at noon plus a half hour, 6.5 hours into the day. Really, noon is the time to bring the Korban Pesach. However, the half hour is simply because you need to be sure that the Korban Pesach is that it's past noon. Because at noon, the sun is in the sky, in the center of the sky. It's hard to tell, and you don't have any shade, any shadows yet to be able to tell you whether the sun is just before noon or just after noon. So you need about a half hour for the sun to have moved in the sky far enough to start creating shadows on the shadow on the eastern side, so you know the sun is more west and that it's past noon. So that's where that half hour comes from. But really, noon is the time. Amar Mar. So we had just said in this teaching that from Alos HaShachar, which is from dawn until the sun actually comes up, until sunrise, is the distance of 5 mil. A person can walk that minola. How do we know this? The Chsifra, it says, it says that as the morning came up, the angels told Lot, and come gather your family, it's time to go. Uksiv, it says, Hashem Mashiach Tzal, as the sun came up on the land, the Lot Batzayara, that Lot and his two daughters came to Tzar. Chanina said, I was there. I saw this place from Sodom till Tzar. And it is exactly a 5 mil distance. So that's the 5 mil. Tomorrow we'll continue with this idea of the Tamei Sheretz according to Ula, with the distance, somebody who's far away according to Ula.